Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be a bit of an algae 101. Now algae is something that I am no stranger to and I get it in the majority of my tanks. The one that I'm sat behind seems to be the most problematic of them all, which is also the high tech, or it's the tank that runs CO2. So it's curious that this is the one that causes me the most issues, when people generally assume that having CO2 or having a high-tech tank is easier. But anyway, that's a video for another day. But today we're just going to run through some algae basics and the type of algae that you are likely to encounter when setting up and running an aquarium. And it's just going to be some tips on causes and solutions, and just sort of touch on them. And then if anybody wants anything a little bit more in depth, I'll be happy to do another video. But for now, we're just going to kind of touch the surface on it, because it is quite a complex topic. And it's also a topic where there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and some people say, well, this worked for me and it hasn't worked for somebody else. So this is very much sort of like my experience and sort of the general consensus as well. If it looks like I'm reading off something, I am. This is another video where I've just wrote my thoughts down because I just wanted to make sure that I didn't miss anything. So yeah, thank you for joining, and I hope that you find this video helpful. And again, apologies if it just looks like I'm looking down all of the time. But yeah, the four main factors that kind of determine the level or background level, or if there is any algae at all within a tank, tend to be light, the amount of healthy plant mass, maintenance routines, and the sort of biological maturity of your tank. So what do those four things mean? Well, plant health is a given, but to avoid algae in your tank, it's recommended to plant very, very densely at the beginning. Now, I've seen the number sort of 70% floating around the internet, and it seems to make sense. So they recommend that at least 70% of the available substrate is covered in plants, and that's preferably fast growers like stems. And generally tanks with less sort of surface area that's being planted, especially in the beginning, can run into some issues, or more likely to run into issues. And that's even more sort of amplified if you're running a high-tech tank whereby you've got high lighting, high amounts of nutrients and high levels of CO2, and you're hammering all that in and you've got barely any plant mass. That's a sort of breeding ground for algae. So yeah, first tip, especially in the start, is plant heavy, dense with healthy plants. Make sure that you've got the healthiest plants that you can get your hands on. The next thing is to make sure that those plants are having their needs met in the way of light, nutrients and CO2. And because plants have different needs, it's best to choose plants that are suitable for your specific tank. So what I mean by that is avoid using sort of demanding or plants that are regarded as difficult in a low-tech tank, and then wonder why you're not getting any success. It's best to sort of plant in groups of plants that are all within a similar category, because they'll grow at a similar rate and they'll have similar requirements. So it's kind of just easier that way. The next thing is to make sure that you trim old growth and overcrowded plants, because this is going to encourage new and healthy growth. And another thing that I tend to do is, if I notice that a plant's being problematic and it's just not really working in the tank, I'll just remove it, because it's just becomes an algae magnet. So if you can just find a new species that looks nice, then just pop that in its place. But the main thing is just to make sure that you're just removing old growth and then replanting healthy tops if you can. So that leads us on to tank maturity. Now, obviously that is something that comes with time, but organic waste is one of the key triggers for algae, and therefore like a strict maintenance routine is needed. So in the early days of setting up your aquarium, your plants are going to be stressed because they're going to be adapting to the new environment. You're going to have soil that's going to be releasing excess nutrients, especially ammonia. You're going to be in the process of adjusting your lighting and trying to find out what's sort of right, and also like the time period as well. And then you know that diatoms are going to be on the way as well, because that's an algae that you just can't really avoid. It happens to pretty much all new setups, especially when you're using a filter that hasn't been cycled. You can kind of combat those diatoms in the early days a little bit using cycled media. But it is one of those things that's almost inevitable, really. So obviously at that point, water changes are key. Having healthy plants is key. And another great thing at the beginning that you can do as well, even if it's just like a temporary assist, is use a lot of floating plants, because the ultimate goal is to achieve a biologically mature tank that is well balanced and a really stable environment, not only for your plants, but for your fish as well. That leads us on to maintenance, which is potentially one of the most important things, but I would say it's important to perform weekly water changes in your aquarium. This obviously helps with any excess waste and detritus. It's also good to do if you're using the sort of overdosing fertilization method, which is where you just purposely overdose the plants, and the plants will do this luxury uptake where they basically take more than they need in preparation for if they're going to be starved of it. But it does mean that you have all these excess nutrients built up in your tank, so that water change just resets the balance again. But it does mean that your plants aren't ever going to be short of anything. So that's a good method, and it's one that I have done before, but it's also quite an expensive method because you're obviously overdosing on the fertilizer. And filters, whilst they're not always necessary, you might have a filterless tank. The benefit of them obviously is that they provide a place for beneficial bacteria, but your tank substrate does as well. But it kind of just ensures that all that like detritus and waste is getting pushed around and then brought back into the filter, so it's not sort of gathering in dead zones in your aquarium. Another thing as well in terms of maintenance is that you kind of want to keep things stable and avoid any parameter swings. If the environment's unstable, plants will potentially get stressed, and plants that are constantly stressed or trying to adapt, again, are just sort of likely culprits for algae. Another thing to consider is the impact of using certain chemicals. So these could be things like medicines or algicides, or whether or not you're using Excel or Easy Carbo or APT Fix or all those sort of things that you can use to kill algae. They can actually have an adverse effect on the tank's ecosystem or the microbiome. So it is quite important that if you are going to be using like a chemical approach or you're medicating your tank, just to reintroduce some beneficial bacteria back into the tank. You kind of think about it like when you take antibiotics, they can harm the microbiome in your gut. So it's always recommended that after you come off them, you take probiotics to then restore that sort of bacteria in your gut. I kind of think it's the same thing with an aquarium. So if I ever do use a chemical or a medication, I tend to just dose sea chem stability again, just to make sure that any beneficial bacteria that's potentially died off is being restored again. And then lastly, lighting. So algae are photosynthetic organisms that require light to grow and also reproduce. So when an aquarium receives too much light, or as in like power, or just an extended exposure of light, it can create an ideal environment for algae to thrive. So the intensity, duration, the spectrum of the lighting, they can all affect algae growth. So it's important to sort of keep an eye on them and properly manage and control the lighting conditions in your aquarium, just to prevent excessive algae growth. I'm just going to have to read this bit because I'm just going to forget it. It's important to consider the needs of your aquatic plants, such as their requirements for high or low lighting, the stability of your tank, and whether they're receiving the necessary nutrients and CO2 to utilise the amount of light energy that they're receiving. So yeah, now that we've like covered off the 4 sort of reasons, or the 4 things that you really need to keep under control in order to prevent algae, let's look at the different types of common algae that you're more likely to come across in your aquarium. So I'm kind of doing this in an order in which I find that they come, but not necessarily. But the first one is definitely diatom. So the causes of this is just a biologically immature tank. So basically new tank syndrome, as it's sometimes called, or the ugly phase. And this can sometimes be worsened. This is a little bit anecdotal, but I have found it to be true, but it can be worsened by silicates and phosphates, which is either in your tap water or in certain sands. So it's not, as I say, it's not always the case. Like me personally, my tap water here is quite high in silicates and phosphates. So my solution for that is obviously, well, one, patience, because it's a new tank and it just happens, and time is a healer in this instance. Obviously keep on top of your water changes, do your weekly water changes, but in the beginning obviously do them daily. And I use Seachem Phosguard in my filter. It's basically like a type of resin, and it removes excess phosphate in your water. Or you can use charcoal. That's kind of like the ADA method, is putting charcoal in your filter. I think that's what Takashi Amano did. Don't quote me on it. But yeah, that's sort of one of the easier algae to get rid of, because it's almost like it's just part of the process. And it comes and it goes and it's fine. It's ugly, don't get me wrong, because it's like brown and hairy. But yeah, so moving on from that, green dust algae, which again is not hugely problematic and it's very easy to get rid of, but the causes of that are usually high light and excess nutrients. Again, something that often happens in the early days of setting up an aquarium, because you're still probably trying to balance your light, and your plants aren't necessarily taking up all of the nutrients that are available to them because they're still adapting, and new soil does release a lot. So obviously the solution to that is just your lighting. Again, keep on with your water changes, and it's just easily removed with a razor scraper. So yeah, that's an algae that I wish was like my usual problem. The next one I've combined because I think they're all a kind of filamentous type algae, but the type of string, thread or hair algae, and it's what they look like is literally given in the name. I think generally spikes in ammonia in new tanks accelerated by high light and unhealthy plants due to nutrient deficiencies. So that's quite a lot to unpack there. But I think you'll find that one of the causes that is the most common is sort of like a spike in ammonia or a nutrient imbalance. And light doesn't necessarily cause algae, or it causes some, but not all, but it definitely can accelerate things. As mentioned earlier, algae is a photosynthetic organism, so it is going to benefit from lighting. But yeah, solutions for this one is obviously to replace the healthy tops and discard all bottoms. So if you notice that the algae is on specific parts of the plant that don't look very healthy, just literally remove them. Take the healthy tops if there is any, and obviously replant them back in, and address your nutrient deficiencies. So that could be in the way of adding fertilizer to the water column or by adding root tabs, but just make sure that you've properly buried the root tab, because that in itself can be a cause of algae if you've not buried it properly and it's sort of closer to the surface and releasing those nutrients. And the last thing is check your nitrates and your phosphates. Now we'll come on to that in a second, because this is something that I find is always the case with my tanks, but we'll come back to that. So staghorn algae, again, it's like a filamentous algae, so the causes and solutions are pretty similar. Again, I think it comes in spikes in ammonia, and high organic waste levels in the tank, so that could be due to like poor maintenance routines. And the solution to that is obviously to have a good maintenance routine and make sure that you stick to a water change schedule. Fertilise obviously as and when needed, and prune your plants again, remove any unhealthy ones and either replant with healthy ones or replant the healthy tops. The other thing is to stabilise your CO2. Another sort of common thread amongst all of these things is CO2 levels, which there is debate on that, because you can have, like, for example, my tanks, low-tech aquariums that don't run CO2, that don't suffer with algae, or at least not major amounts of algae. So yeah, I think low-tech is sort of redefining what we know about aquascaping in terms of like CO2 and things like that. But if CO2 is present but it's unstable, maybe your solenoid's broken, maybe you're not injecting like a constant amount all the time, that obviously can cause the algae in your tank. And the last one that we've got on here, although I am going to touch on another one briefly actually, is BBA. This seems to be like the most dreaded algae of them all. It's just like the daddy of all algae. And this is one that I have had in every version of this tank that I've done. I say every version, I've only done 2. But both versions of this tank I've had BBA. So, and this I think is most definitely linked to CO2. So I found, because this is one that creates sort of the most debate online, but I found that the causes of BBA, especially in my experience, are excessive flow with heavy CO2 misting, especially on slow growing plants, and the hardscape, which is potentially worsened by poor maintenance and unhealthy unhealthy plants. But yeah, the main thing is just tons of CO2 hitting plants that just aren't going to utilize it. So there is a video on my channel which I will link, but I used to basically have the inline diffuser in this scape, and it was at this side of the tank and the lily pipe was here. So the flow was going this way, hitting the CO2, and the main mist was just hitting all the epiphytes at the front, which obviously don't really require that much CO2, and the plants in the back were getting very little. So I was getting BBA on all the leaves of my boost and things like that. And then when I switched to this Aquarium NeoFlow, which I am going to do a review on because I am, because I get a lot of questions about it on a video that I've done previously, and what my thoughts on it are, which, yeah, I'm not going to give too much away. I'm not going to say it's the most brilliant invention ever, but it's also not the worst. But it has helped me with BBA, so for that I'll give it 10 points. Because now the CO2 is coming through the outlet and it's like mixing in with the outflow. So it's almost like a cheat version of an inline diffuser. Sorry, I meant in-tank diffuser, not inline diffuser earlier. Confusing. We'll talk about that in another video, but you get the point. And the last one that I'm just going to touch upon, it wasn't originally in this video, but I have got it in one of my tanks. Actually, I've got it in 3 of my tanks. It's cladophora algae, and my honest answer to that is I don't know. I think that it has come, I've bought like plants and moss and things like that off eBay before, and I think that it came on some Physidans moss that I got a few years ago, because that's when I first noticed it. And for some reason there is Physidans moss, even though I've only ever put it in one tank, growing in all of my tanks, and I think it's spread. Someone's at the door. Rude. And I think it's spread. So I think it's an almost contagious type of algae. And the only way that I have found to cure it, so to speak, is using APT algae fix. And I don't know if that is a permanent long-term solution, but that's the only thing that I've managed to find that kind of works. So going back to what we were saying about phosphates and nitrates, I think when you've had an aquarium for a while, you do tend to sort of become in tune with it and realise what's wrong with it, or at least when you have one long term, because this has been set up for over a year now. So personally, when something's going wrong in the scape, my 2 go-to checks are the nitrate levels and the phosphate levels, because generally when something's going wrong and I do a water test, and I highly recommend that you buy or invest in a complete water testing kit, and I'll show you the one that I use. And over time you'll use it less and less because you'll just know the signs. But generally when there's a problem with algae in my scape, I will test the nitrates, and usually before I even see the results, I know that the nitrates are going to be on 0. They're going to be absolutely depleted. And I also know the phosphate levels are going to be off the scale. Now, that is because they do build up over time, and I do have high phosphate levels in my water. So water changes aren't really going to dilute those. They're always going to be at a certain level. Now, a product that I mentioned earlier was Seachem Phosguard, and I use that in my filter. Now, I can't remember how it works, but it's like it's like a resin that causes this sort of like exchange. And so it does remove some of the phosphates and silicates from the water, but as I said, that gets depleted over time. So when the levels are high, it's a sign for me to A, replace the PhosGuard in the filter, and B, start dosing a fertilizer. Now, I have just moved over to using a complete, like, all-in-one, because honestly, I don't fully understand individual dosing, and I don't really have the time to, especially with having as many tanks as I do, to check sort of like the individual levels of each macro or micronutrient. So I've moved over to using like a all-in-one complete fertilizer. This is just a 2-hour Aquarist one that I've been trialing, and yeah, it seems good. In the past, I've mainly used the Tropica, which again, I rate as well, but I'm happy to sort of try new products just to see, if they make a difference. So yeah, they would be my 2 go-to things first, and then after that will be lighting. I generally find that for me, those are the things, because if you're running CO2 and you've got a full or enough CO2 in your tank, and you're using a quality CO2 solenoid that's injecting at a steady rate, it's probably not going to be your CO2, unless you've done something drastic with your plants, and you've maybe removed some, or you've, I don't know, done what I've done and replanted it a million times, where they're maybe not going to be utilising that CO2. It probably isn't that. If you've got that balance, that shouldn't really change. So it's probably going to be down to the lighting. And I know your lighting doesn't change, but you do trim plants, and that sends them into almost like a state of shock. So they're not going to be using quite as much sort of light power. So I feel like I've just really droned on there. But yeah, my point is, I would check your nitrates, your phosphates, and your lighting. And lastly, yeah, my tip would be invest in a water testing kit, a complete one that measures like things like nutrients, so that it can measure things like iron, phosphate, potassium, iron, if I've not already said that, nitrogen, ammonia, all of that stuff, nitrogen, nitrates, ammonia, that can check all of those things, because the best thing that you can do is know your water parameters, because that's already half the battle completed. That's already half the battle won, sorry, because in the beginning, when I was getting loads of problems, I was just guessing everything, and you can end up making things worse, or you don't know what it is that's worked and for what reason, why it's worked. So when I found out that my tap water was really high in phosphate, I knew then what to do. So that would be the best advice I can give on that front. So I hope you found this video informative, and I hope you can take something from it. If you do have any questions, please leave them in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer. And if you want a little bit more of an in-depth video, again, please leave that in the comments. If there's something that you want to know, specific algae, then we can maybe look into doing something like that. I'm not a top professional or anything, but I feel qualified to talk about algae because I've had so much of it. But yeah, that's going to do it for this video. The next video, which is a build video, it's a very, very mini low-tech Wallstad tank. It's just been scaped and planted this weekend, and I should be posting it soon. So stick around for that one. And again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.